The morning of February 14th, 1943, dawned grey and humid over Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. Second Lieutenant Roger Haberman adjusted his seat harness inside the cockpit of his F4U Corsair, feeling the unfamiliar angle of the fuselage beneath him. The cockpit sat far back, nearly 3 feet aft of where it should be, giving him an obstructed view over that impossibly long nose. Through the haze, he could see the other 11 Corsairs of VMF 124 warming their engines, the distinctive inverted gull wings, making them look like enormous seabirds preparing for flight. These aircraft had been on Guadalcanal for exactly 2 days. Today would mark their first true test against the enemy. Haberman had heard the stories. Every Marine pilot in the South Pacific had. The Mitsubishi A6M0 was the most feared fighter in the theatre, a machine that had swept aside British hurricanes over Ceylon, demolished Chinese opposition, and sent American wildcats spiraling into the sea throughout 1942. Japanese pilots, the veterans said, flew with supernatural skill, their aircraft turning inside anything the Allies could field. And now here he sat, strapped into this peculiar beast with the bent wings, preparing to escort a formation of PB-4Y bombers on a strike against Japanese shipping near Bougainville. He didn't know that by sunset, his squadron would be part of what historians would call the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, a brutal introduction to combat that would force the Marine Corps to fundamentally reconsider how they employed their new fighter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. But to understand what happened that day, and why Japanese pilots initially viewed the Corsair with something between curiosity and contempt, we must first understand the world these men inhabited, a world where the Zero had reigned, supreme for nearly 3 years, and where Japanese naval aviators considered themselves the finest in the sky. When the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service began the Pacific War in December 1941, it possessed what was arguably the most skilled cadre of naval aviators in the world. The training program that produced these men was brutal in its selectivity. Saburo Sakai, who would become one of Japan's most celebrated aces, later wrote that more than 1,500 young men applied for his training class. Only 70 were selected. 25 graduated. The entire course consumed years of a young man's life, demanding absolute perfection in every maneuver, every landing, every gunnery run. By the time a Japanese naval aviator reached operational status in 1941, he typically had 700 hours of flight time, more than twice what his American counterpart possessed. And the aircraft they flew seemed to justify this confidence. The Mitsubishi A6M0, when it first appeared over China in 1940, represented a quantum leap in fighter design. Designer Jiro Horikoshi had been handed what seemed like an impossible specification. Create an aircraft capable of 310 miles per hour at 13,000 feet, able to climb to 10,000 feet in less than 10 minutes, equipped with both 20mm cannons and machine guns, and possessing an operational range that would allow it to escort bombers across distances that would ground any Western fighter. Horikoshi's solution was radical. Strip away everything unnecessary. No armor plate for the pilot, no self-sealing fuel tanks. Use a new lightweight aluminum alloy called extra super duraluminum for the airframe. Employ large ailerons optimized for aerobatic performance between 180 and 250 miles per hour at 10,000 to 15,000 feet. The result was an aircraft that weighed barely 5,000 pounds empty, a wraith that could turn inside anything else in the sky, cruise for over 1,000 miles without external tanks, and possess firepower that could shred enemy aircraft with a single well-aimed burst. When the Zero encountered British and American fighters in the opening months of the war, the results bordered on the catastrophic for the Allies. Over Ceylon, in April 1942, 36 Zeros took on 60 British aircraft and shot down 27 of them while losing just 1 Zero. Against the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, the disparity was almost as severe. Wildcat pilots filed reports describing an enemy that could climb faster, turn tighter, and stay aloft longer than anything in the American inventory. The official American tactical doctrine for pilots encountering the Zero became brutally simple. run away. By early 1943, Japanese pilots operating from Rabaul and throughout the Solomon Islands had developed an almost arrogant confidence in their supremacy. They flew in, 3 aircraft formations called shotai, with the flight leader ranging far ahead while 2 wingmen wove back and forth, covering blind spots and preparing to attack in succession one after another, never giving the enemy a moment's respite. When American formations appeared, Japanese pilots would assess the opposition with a practiced eye, noting the types and formations, then methodically dissect them using superior maneuverability. So when intelligence reports began filtering back to Rabaul in early February 1943 that a new American fighter had arrived at Guadalcanal, the response among Japanese aviators was more curiosity than concern. The Americans had tried before. The Wildcat had been outclassed. The Army's P-40 Warhawk, while rugged, couldn't match the Zero in a turning fight. Even the twin-engine P-38 Lightning, despite its speed and twin-boom design, could be bested by a skilled Zero pilot who knew how to exploit the Lightning's poor roll rate at high speed. And then the reconnaissance photographs arrived, showing aircraft with the most peculiar wing configuration anyone had seen, wings that bent downward from the fuselage like the wings of a seabird in flight, then angled back up at the wingtips. The shape was so unusual that some Japanese pilots initially questioned whether the photographs had been doctored. Why would the Americans build a fighter with such an aerodynamically awkward wing design? Surely this was evidence of engineering desperation, not innovation. What the Japanese pilots couldn't know from simple reconnaissance photographs was that the Corsair's distinctive inverted gull wing was not a weakness, but rather an elegant solution to a complex engineering problem. And that problem began with raw power. In 1938, when the United States Navy issued specifications for a new carrier-based fighter, the requirements were clear. Create an aircraft that could exceed 400 miles per hour, a speed that conventional wisdom said was impossible for a carrier-based fighter, which had to be robust enough to withstand the brutal stress of carrier landings. The Vought Aircraft Corporation, under the leadership of chief designer Rex Beisel, decided to build their aircraft around the most powerful engine available, the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine producing 2,000 horsepower. But that massive engine required an equally massive propeller to convert all that power into thrust. The engineering team selected a Hamilton Standard Hydromatic 3-blade propeller, spanning 13 feet and 1 inch in diameter, the largest propeller ever fitted to a single-engine fighter. And therein lay the problem. How do you provide adequate ground clearance for a 13-foot propeller without using landing gear struts, so long they become structurally compromised? Beisel's solution was the inverted gull wing. By bending the wings downward at the root, then angling them back up toward the tips, the designers could keep the landing gear attachment points low while maintaining the necessary clearance for that enormous propeller. The design had additional benefits. The anhedral of the inboard wing section allowed the wing and fuselage to meet at an optimal angle for minimizing drag, eliminating the need for bulky wing root fairings. But the bent wing was heavier than a conventional design and more difficult to manufacture, a compromise the engineers accepted in exchange for the performance they needed. The first F4U prototype flew on May 29, 1940. Test pilot Lyman Bullard took it up from the Stratford facility, and what he discovered shocked even the engineers who had built it. On October 1, 1940, the F4U became the first single-engine American fighter to exceed 400 miles per hour, achieving an average ground speed of 405 miles per hour on a test flight from Stratford to Hartford. In full-power dives, the aircraft reached 550 miles per hour speeds that caused access panels to buckle and, in one case, an engine failure from the sheer aerodynamic stress. The Corsair could climb at over 3,000 feet per minute. Its service ceiling exceeded 37,000 feet. The 650 caliber Browning machine guns mounted in the wings, 3 per side, carried 2,300 rounds total, providing nearly 30 seconds of sustained fire. Each gun could fire 600 rounds per minute, creating a cone of destruction that could soar through enemy aircraft at combat ranges. The aircraft could absorb tremendous battle damage, and still bring its pilot home, thanks to armor plate weighing 150 pounds and a 1.5-inch bulletproof windscreen. But the Corsair also had problems, serious problems that nearly killed the program before it reached combat. The rearward placement of the day, cockpit, necessitated by the fuel tank location, gave pilots severely restricted forward visibility, particularly during the approach to landing. The aircraft had a vicious stall characteristic at slow speeds. The powerful torque of that massive engine and propeller created asymmetric thrust effects that could flip an unwary pilot during takeoff. The short tailwheel strut combined with stiff main landing gear meant the aircraft had a tendency to bounce on touchdown, causing the tailhook to skip over the arresting wires on carrier decks. These problems led the Navy to make a fateful decision in early 1943. Assign the Corsair primarily to the Marine Corps for land-based operations, while the Navy would standardize on the more docile Grumman F6F Hellcat for carrier operations. It was this decision that brought VMF 124 to Guadalcanal on February 12, 1943, 2 days before they would meet the Zero in combat. The morning of February 14th opened, with clear skies over Bougainville. At Kahili Airfield, near the island's southern tip, 42 Zero fighters of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service prepared for defensive operations. Coast watchers, those dedicated Australian and native scouts who monitored Japanese movements throughout the Solomons, had already radioed warnings that an American bomber formation was assembling over Guadalcanal. The Japanese pilots knew the Americans would come. They always did. And when they arrived, the Zeros would be waiting. The American formation consisted of 9 PB 4Y1 Liberators from Marine Bombing Squadron 101, escorted by 12 Corsairs from VMF, 1, 2, 4 and 10 P-38, Lightnings from the 339th Fighter Squadron. The bombers' target was either the Kahili airfield itself or Japanese shipping in Buin Bay. Sources differ on the precise objective, but the target mattered less than the fact that this represented the first time the new Corsair would face the Zero in sustained combat. Major William Gies, commanding VMF 124, had spent the previous day trying to glean tactical advice from experienced Wildcat pilots. The guidance he received was frustratingly vague. You have to go after them. But everyone knew it would take more than aggression. The Corsair pilots had barely 2 days to familiarize themselves with the combat environment, the geography of the Solomons, the locations of Japanese bases. They were flying into battle with aircraft they had been operating for less than 4 months, most of that time stateside, against an enemy who had been honing their skills in combat for over a year. As the formation droned northwest toward Bougainville, a flight of over 200 miles from Guadalcanal, the pilots maintained strict radio silence. In the bombers, crews checked their defensive guns and bomb loads. In the fighters, pilots scanned the sky continuously, knowing that Japanese radar and coastwatcher networks meant the defenders would have ample warning. The key question wasn't whether they would be intercepted, but when and how violently. The interception came approximately 10 minutes before the formation reached its target. The 42 Zeros dove from altitude, having climbed to meet the Americans with an enormous energy advantage. What followed was a swirling melee that lasted 30 minutes and showcased precisely why the Zero had dominated the Pacific skies for so long. The Japanese pilots, many of them veterans with hundreds of hours of combat experience, employed tactics refined over months of combat, slash attacks from altitude, exploitation of the Zero's superior maneuverability whenever American fighters tried to engage in turning combat, and coordinated assaults that left American pilots fighting multiple opponents simultaneously. The Corsair and Lightning pilots fought back with what they knew, but in air combat, experience matters more than raw performance, when tactics haven't yet been developed to exploit that performance. The Japanese pilots forced the American fighters into slow-speed turning engagements, where the Zero's lack of weight and large ailerons gave it an insurmountable advantage. When Corsair pilots tried to use their superior speed to escape, they found themselves facing follow-up attacks from other Zeros that had been positioned to cut off escape routes. By the time the battered formation limped back to Guadalcanal, the butcher's bill was severe. 2 PB-4Y bombers shot down, 4 P-38 Lightnings destroyed, and 2 Corsairs lost. The Japanese lost exactly 1-0, with 2 aviators wounded. American pilots claimed 14 zeros, and 1 floatplane destroyed claims that bore no relationship to reality, but reflected the chaotic nature of air combat, where multiple pilots often fired at the same aircraft, and each assumed their fire was decisive. The Americans inevitably named the engagement the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. The aftermath of the St. Valentine's Day engagement sent shockwaves through American command in the South Pacific. The Corsair, this supposedly revolutionary fighter that had broken speed records and promised air superiority, had been roughly handled by an enemy flying aircraft designed in the late 1930s. For the next 2 months, daylight bomber missions to Bougainville were suspended until American commanders could develop tactics that would allow their fighters to provide adequate escort. The Corsairs of VMF 124 flew patrol missions, trained relentlessly, and waited for another chance to prove themselves. But within those frustrating weeks of limited combat, a handful of pilots began to understand something crucial. The Corsair hadn't failed on February 14th. Its pilots had simply fought the wrong kind of battle. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Ambrose Walsh was one of those pilots. A former enlisted man who had worked his way up through the ranks, Walsh possessed a methodical mind that analyzed combat, encounters with engineering precision. After the Valentine's Day disaster, he spent hours debriefing with other pilots, reviewing gun camera footage when available, and thinking through the fundamental physics of aerial combat. The Corsair, he realized, had been designed to exploit advantages that his squadron had completely ignored in their first engagement. The Zero could turn. Everyone knew that. But the Corsair could climb. It could dive. It could outrun the Zero by more than 50 miles per hour in level flight. The key was altitude, not just having it, but understanding how it dictated every subsequent decision in combat. Walsh began developing a tactical doctrine that would later be adopted throughout marine aviation. First principle: never enter combat below 15,000 feet, if possible. The Corsair's powerful engine and supercharger meant it maintained excellent performance at altitudes where the Zero began to labor. Second principle: never, under any circumstances, engage in a slow-speed turning fight with a Zero. The Japanese fighter could sustain turns at speeds where the Corsair would stall and fall out of the sky. Third principle: use speed as both weapon and shield. Dive on the enemy from altitude, make a single high-speed firing pass, then use the accumulated energy to zoom back to altitude before the Zero could react. Walsh summarized it with brutal simplicity. Whoever had altitude dictated the terms of the battle, and there was nothing a Zero pilot could do to change that. If a Corsair pilot maintained his altitude advantage and refused to be drawn into a slow-speed dogfight, he controlled the engagement completely. But doctrine on paper meant nothing without the opportunity to test it in combat. That opportunity came on April 1st, 1943. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the Japanese Combined Fleet and architect of Pearl Harbor, had initiated Operation Igo, a 2-week aerial offensive designed to smash Allied positions from New Guinea to Guadalcanal. On the morning of April 1st, a massive strike force of Japanese aircraft launched from Rabaul, bound for the Russell Islands. Ken Walsh was airborne that morning, leading a flight of 4 Corsairs on combat air patrol, when the call came through: large enemy formation inbound. Walsh took his flight to 20,000 feet and waited. When the Japanese aircraft appeared below him, he had exactly the advantage his doctrine required: altitude, speed, and the initiative to dictate when and how the engagement would begin. He rolled into a dive, lined up a Zero in his gun sight, and fired a 3-second burst from his 650 caliber machine guns. The combined weight of fire, 1,800 rounds per minute, struck the Zero's unarmored fuselage and set it ablaze. Walsh didn't watch it fall. He was already pulling back on the stick, using his excess speed to zoom back above the fight, positioning for another attack. By the end of the engagement, Walsh had shot down 2 Japanese aircraft. More importantly, he had proven that the Corsair, flown correctly, could not only survive against the Zero but dominate it. Within weeks, Walsh would become the first Corsair ace, eventually accumulating 20 confirmed victories. But his greater contribution was the tactical framework he developed and shared with other squadrons arriving in the theatre. As spring turned to summer in 1943, more Marine squadrons transitioned to the Corsair. VMF 213 arrived in March, initially equipped with Wildcats but re-equipped with Corsairs before entering combat. VMF 214, the famous Black Sheep squadron that would later be commanded by Gregory "Pappy" Boyington, formed in August. Each squadron learned from the bitter lessons of those who had gone before, refining and expanding on Walsh's basic principles. The Japanese pilots noticed the change. At first, gradually, then with increasing alarm. Commander Zenjiro Miyano had flown Zeros since 1941. He had been over Pearl Harbor, had flown combat missions throughout the East Indies campaign, and had spent the past year defending Rabaul against increasingly aggressive American attacks. He was an exceptional pilot by any standard, with the reflexes and spatial awareness that separated aces from average aviators. And by mid-1943, he was deeply worried. The American fighter with the bent wings, which Japanese intelligence had identified as the F4U, was becoming more numerous and, more concerningly, more tactically sophisticated. In the early encounters, Zero pilots had found the F4U pilots willing to engage in the kind of slow-speed maneuvering combat where Japanese advantages were decisive. But increasingly, the Corsair pilots refused that kind of fight. They stayed high, they dove fast, they fired and climbed away before Japanese pilots could react. And when forced into close combat, they demonstrated that the Corsair, despite its bulk, could roll faster than the Zero at high speeds, a capability that allowed them to reverse direction and evade pursuit. Miyano had shot down several Corsairs, but never easily, and usually only when tactical circumstances gave him an overwhelming advantage, multiple Zeros against a single Corsair, or surprise attacks where the American pilot had no altitude cushion to work with. In straight-up combat between equally skilled pilots with similar tactical positions, the Corsair was proving to be at minimum an equal opponent and possibly superior. The physical differences between the aircraft became impossible to ignore in combat. The Zero could turn inside the Corsair at slow speeds, true, but the Corsair could outrun the Zero by more than 50 miles per hour. In a dive, the disparity was even worse. The Corsair could pull away from a pursuing Zero as if the Japanese fighter were standing still, and if a Corsair pilot chose to run, there was simply no way to catch him. This fundamentally altered the psychology of combat. Zero pilots, accustomed to feeling like they could always press an attack or chase down a fleeing enemy, now found themselves watching American fighters accelerate beyond reach, climbing back to altitude to attack again at their leisure. The Corsair's armament also proved devastating. The Zero's 220mm cannons had superior range and hitting power compared to the Corsair's 50-caliber machine guns, but they carried limited ammunition and required precise aim. The Corsair's 6 machine guns, with 2,300 rounds total, meant American pilots could afford to fire longer bursts, could sustain combat through multiple engagements, and could spray enough lead through a given volume of sky to guarantee hits, even if individual rounds were less powerful. And when those rounds did hit the Zero's unarmored structure, the results were catastrophic. Fuel tanks that had been left unprotected to save weight would ignite from a single incendiary round. Wing spars made from lightweight aluminum would buckle and fail under sustained fire. By summer of 1943, Japanese pilots had developed a grudging respect for the Corsair that bordered on superstitious fear. The aircraft produced a distinctive sound in high-speed dives, a whistling scream created by air rushing through the engine cooling vents and intakes. Japanese ground troops began to associate that sound with incoming death, as Corsairs transitioned from pure fighter roles to fighter-bomber missions, delivering bombs and rockets with brutal precision against ground positions. Some accounts claimed Japanese forces called the Corsair "Whistling Death," though this appears to have been a post-war invention by Vought's publicity department. What was undeniable was that by late 1943, The Corsair had shattered the aura of invincibility that had surrounded the Zero for the war's first 2 years. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The tactical evolution was only part of the story. The other part was industrial, a disparity so vast that it doomed Japanese aviation regardless of individual pilot skill or aircraft design. Lieutenant Commander Harutoshi Okamoto commanded the last Zero units, defending Rabaul in late 1943. He was the same officer who had introduced the Zero to the Solomon Islands Theatre back in February 1942, and now he presided over its decline. The mathematics of the situation were brutally simple and utterly inescapable. American aircraft production in 1943 was approaching 50,000 aircraft per year. Fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, every category. Of those, more than 500 Corsairs were being delivered monthly at peak production. Vort's Stratford plant, Goodyear's Akron facility, and Brewster's Long Island factory were producing Corsairs around the clock. At times, production exceeded 18 aircraft per day. These weren't experimental prototypes or hand-built machines. They were production line aircraft, each virtually identical, each accompanied by full documentation, spare parts, and maintenance equipment. Japan, by contrast, produced approximately 5,000 aircraft total in 1941, rising to 28,000 in 1944. The entire production run for all variants of the Zero from 1940 through 1945 totaled just over 10,000 aircraft. This meant that the United States was producing more Corsairs alone in a single year than Japan produced Zeros over the entire war. And the Corsair was just one of multiple American fighter types flooding into the Pacific theater. The F-6F Hellcat, the P-38 Lightning, the P-47 Thunderbolt, all were being produced in quantities that Japanese industry simply could not match. The pilot training disparity was equally stark. American pilot training programs were producing hundreds of new aviators monthly, each with over 500 hours of flight time by 1944. The Navy and Marine Corps had implemented a rotation system where experienced combat pilots returned to training commands as instructors, ensuring that each new generation of pilots learned from veterans' actual combat experience. This created a virtuous cycle. As American pilots gained experience, they passed that knowledge to trainees, who entered combat already aware of effective tactics against Japanese aircraft. Japanese pilot training, by contrast, collapsed under the weight of attrition and resource shortages. The program that had produced superbly trained aviators in 1941 men with 700 hours of flight time was producing pilots with 90 hours by 1945. Fuel shortages meant trainees couldn't practice advanced maneuvers. The loss of experienced pilots in combat meant fewer instructors available to train replacements. And crucially, Japan never implemented a rotation system. Skilled pilots remained in combat until they were killed, taking their accumulated knowledge to the bottom of the Pacific with them. Okamoto watched this deterioration firsthand at Rabaul. New pilots arrived at his command with barely enough training to find their aircraft carriers, let alone engage in high-speed combat against tactically sophisticated American pilots flying superior aircraft. Some couldn't properly execute carrier landings. Others panicked in combat, breaking formation and fleeing, or freezing and becoming easy targets. The pilot who in 1941 had needed to master hundreds of hours of training before reaching operational status was being replaced by young men who knew how to take off, fly straight, and maybe shoot. The engagements over Rabaul in late 1943 illustrated this disparity with tragic clarity. On November 1st, the U.S. Navy launched a massive carrier strike against Rabaul's harbour and airfield. Okamoto scrambled every serviceable Zero to defend the base. The resulting air battle was desperately one-sided. American Corsairs and Hellcats, flown by pilots with months of combat experience and hundreds of hours of training, carved through formations of Zeros flown by teenagers who had never seen combat before. Japanese pilots who tried to employ the turning tactics that had worked in 1942 found themselves unable to outturn even the heavier American fighters. when those fighters maintained high speeds and exploited their superior power-to-weight ratios. By February 1944, exactly 1 year after the St. Valentine's Day massacre, the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service evacuated its surviving pilots from Rabaul. The base that had been the forward anchor of Japanese air power in the South Pacific was effectively abandoned, its airfields cratered, and its defences stripped. The Zero continued to fight throughout the rest of the war, but increasingly as a symbol of desperation rather than dominance, eventually being adapted for kamikaze missions, where pilot skill became irrelevant. The Corsair, meanwhile, went from strength to strength. The initial carrier landing problems that had led to the aircraft being assigned primarily to land-based marine squadrons were gradually solved through modifications to the landing gear, improvements to pilot training, and techniques developed by British Fleet Air Arm pilots. By April 1944, the U. Navy accepted the Corsair for carrier operations, and by December, marine squadrons were operating from carriers as effectively as they had from land bases. Captain Art Miller sat in his Corsair cockpit on the morning of April 10, 1945, and tried not to think about how far he was from home. Okinawa sprawled below him, its hills and fields contested by American and Japanese forces in what had become one of the war's bloodiest campaigns. His mission today was close air support, dive-bombing Japanese positions with 500-pound bombs, then strafing with his 650 caliber machine guns anything that moved in designated target zones. It was inglorious work compared to air-to-air combat, but by April 1945, there were precious few Japanese aircraft left to fight. The kamikaze attacks had intensified, but those were desperate missions flown by barely trained pilots in aircraft, often too damaged or obsolete for conventional combat. The Corsair's role had evolved from pure fighter to fighter-bomber, and it excelled at this new mission. The aircraft that could carry 650 caliber machine guns could also carry 4,000 pounds of bombs or 8 5-inch rockets. Its ability to absorb punishment meant it could fly through intense anti-aircraft fire, deliver its ordnance with devastating accuracy, and return to base with battle damage that would have destroyed lesser aircraft. Miller rolled into his dive, lining up the target a suspected Japanese artillery position concealed in trees, and pickled his bombs. He felt the aircraft surge upward as 2,000 pounds left the wing racks. Then he was pulling back on the stick, climbing away from the target zone as anti-aircraft fire traced orange lines through the air behind him. Something struck his aircraft, 2 distinct thuds that he felt through the control stick, but the Corsair kept flying. He made it back to the carrier, landed safely, and discovered that 2 20mm shells from friendly fire, nervous American naval gunners, shooting at anything that came near the fleet, had struck his fuselage. The Corsair's robust construction had kept those shells from reaching anything vital. This was the Corsair's final form. Not the sleek air superiority fighter of early propaganda, but a brutally effective multi-role aircraft that could do anything the war demanded. By VJ Day on September 2, 1945, Corsairs had flown 64,000 operational sorties, 44% of all U.S. Navy and Marine fighter sorties in the Pacific War. They had claimed 2,140 air-to-air victories against 189 losses to enemy aircraft, an 11-to-1 kill ratio that represented the lowest loss rate of any Allied fighter in the Pacific. Against the Zero specifically, the ratio was 12-to-1. But these statistics, impressive as they sound, require context. The Corsair's dominant combat record was achieved primarily during 1943 and early 1944, when it faced the Zero in intense air-to-air combat over the Solomons and Rabaul. As operations shifted northward and the Corsair transitioned primarily to ground attack roles, it saw progressively less exposure to enemy fighters, while other types, particularly the F-6F Hellcat, bore the brunt of air-to-air combat in the war's final year. The 11-to-1 ratio was real, but it reflected not just the Corsair's technical superiority, but also the catastrophic deterioration of Japanese pilot quality and the strategic shift that removed the Corsair from fighter-pure operations. The true measure of the Corsair's impact lies not in statistics, but in the psychological transformation it forced upon both sides. For American pilots, the aircraft represented a hard-won lesson. Technological superiority means nothing without tactical sophistication. The F4U that arrived at Guadalcanal in February 1943 was the same aircraft that achieved dominance by late that year. But the pilots flying it had fundamentally changed how they fought. They had learned to exploit altitude, to refuse disadvantageous combat, to use speed and climb rate as primary weapons. These lessons would inform American fighter tactics for generations. For Japanese pilots, the Corsair represented the collision of propaganda with reality. They had been taught that Japanese engineering, Japanese training, and Japanese warrior spirit made them inherently superior to their Western opponents. The Zero's early dominance seemed to confirm this worldview. But the Corsair, and more broadly, the entire weight of American industrial production demolished those comforting myths. Japanese pilots found themselves flying obsolescent aircraft with barely adequate training against opponents who had every material advantage. The bent-wing fighter they had initially dismissed, perhaps even laughed at for its unusual configuration, became the symbol of that broader reality. Some Japanese pilots continued to achieve victories against Corsairs throughout the war. Skilled veterans flying early morning or evening missions, where American numerical superiority was temporarily negated, could still exploit the Zero's residual advantages. But these were increasingly rare exceptions. By mid-1944, most Japanese fighter pilots knew they were flying inferior aircraft, with inadequate support, against an enemy that could replace every loss many times over, while Japan could not. The Corsair's distinctive bent wings, originally designed purely to solve an engineering problem, became one of the war's most recognizable silhouettes. Marines on the ground at Okinawa called the aircraft the sweetheart of Okinawa for its devastating close air support. The whistling sound it made in high-speed dives became associated with salvation for American ground troops and doom for Japanese defenders. And though the war ended before the Corsair could fully prove itself in the jet age, the aircraft continued serving in Korea, where one Marine pilot, Captain Jesse Folmar, even shot down a MiG-15 jet fighter in aerial combat, a piston engine fighter defeating a jet, testament to both the Corsair's enduring capabilities and the skill of its pilots. In the end, the F4U Corsair validated a design philosophy that prioritized maximum performance over ease of operation. The aircraft was never easy to fly. The long nose that restricted visibility, the powerful torque that could flip an unwary pilot during takeoff, the tendency to stall viciously at slow speeds, these characteristics never fully disappeared. Navy pilots called it the ensign eliminator because it killed so many inexperienced aviators during training. The accident rate was deplorable. 692 Corsairs were lost in non-operational accidents, far exceeding the 189 lost to enemy aircraft in air-to-air combat. But for pilots who mastered the aircraft, who learned to work with its quirks rather than against them, the Corsair offered capabilities unmatched by any other fighter in the Pacific theater during its peak operational period. The bent wings that had seemed so odd, perhaps even comical to some observers, proved to be exactly what the aircraft needed, a solution that enabled massive power, outstanding performance, and acceptable carrier operations once modifications were complete. More than 12,000 Corsairs were built over a production run that lasted from 1942 through 1953, longer than any other American propeller-driven fighter. The aircraft served with multiple nations after the war: the British Royal Navy, the French Navy, New Zealand, and various Latin American air forces. Some remained in combat service into the 1960s, nearly a quarter century after the first prototype flew. But the Corsair's truest legacy lies in the lesson it taught about aerial combat in the industrial age. Technical specifications matter less than how those specifications are employed in actual combat, and both matter less than the industrial capacity to replace losses and train skilled crews. The Japanese pilots who initially dismissed or even laughed at the Corsair's bent wings were highly skilled aviators flying an excellent aircraft. They lost not because they were inferior warriors, but because they were outproduced, outmanned, and ultimately outfought by an enemy who could afford to learn from mistakes and who possessed the resources to exploit technological advantages once the proper tactics were developed. Second Lieutenant Kenneth Walsh, the first Corsair ace, perhaps understood this better than most. In debriefings after the war, he was asked to summarize what made the Corsair effective against the Zero. His answer was characteristically precise. "I learned quickly that altitude was paramount. Whoever had altitude dictated the terms of the battle, and there was nothing a Zero pilot could do to change that." But then he added something more reflective. "There were times I tangled with a Zero at slow speed, one-on-one. I considered myself fortunate to survive those battles. Even in a superior aircraft, employing superior tactics with superior support, combat remained desperately uncertain. The margin between victory and death was often measured in fractions of a second, in feet of altitude, in the split-second decision to press an attack or break away." The Corsair gave American pilots an edge, but it never guaranteed survival. That required skill, luck, and the willingness to learn from those who hadn't survived. The bent-wing bird that Japanese pilots had laughed at in February 1943 became, by war's end, one of the most feared aircraft in the Pacific. Not because of its unusual wings, but because of what those wings enabled: an aircraft fast enough to catch anything, powerful enough to climb away from danger, and tough enough to bring its pilot home through conditions that would have destroyed its opponents. In the calculus of war, those capabilities proved decisive, and the laughter, if it had ever truly existed, had long since died in the skies over the Solomons, replaced by the whistling shriek of a Corsair diving to attack a sound that signaled the end of one era and the beginning of another. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.